Well, good morning. It is Friday, March 1st. I'm slowly waiting for YouTube. It's having a moment. I'm going to get started. And when YouTube catches up with us, that's great. I'll just kind of do a little bit of a background on what's happening today. So today at City Hall, we have something called She Governs. It is a day where young women from across the city in grades 9 through 12 come and practice being a model council. This year the program has expanded and there's two topics. Traditionally there's been one model council, so limited to about 15 young ladies. This year we're doing two. The first topic they just did housing. The second topic they're doing transit. Okay, I'm just moving these because I'm just trying to get the YouTube to get going again here. Anyway, so this is the 5th year, and I'm so excited. I love spending the day with the kids. So I start with breakfast in the morning with them. Then they're on a bit of a break right now, which is why I'm jumping in here. And then I'll go back and watch the second one. And then we do a speakers panel, and then we'll have lunch, and then we do a speakers panel. And the speakers panel, so myself, Councillor Meehan, Councillor Winus, Councillor Sharp, and the Mayor, and then they've prepared questions for us and we get to respond. So I'm very excited about that. And I'm sorry, I keep looking at the spinny wheel. I'm getting the spinny wheel on YouTube, but I'm just going to keep going now with Instagram and Facebook. And I can always download and post to the YouTube later. So that's what's going to happen. There is a lot of talk around rezoning happening in the proposed changes to rezone communities from the base district of RC1, which stands for Residential Contextual 1, to RCG, which is Residential Contextual 2, RCG, Residential Contextual Ground Oriented, which means that entrances happen at the ground level or a couple stairs up. So I want to talk about that. There's lots of questions that are coming out around it. There's lots of comments that are coming out around it. The plan is to do a larger, kind of more fulsome, one and done response in early April. The public hearing on this is April 22nd. But I'm going to sprinkle some conversation between now and then. So for the next 4 weeks, sprinkle some conversation into the 15-minute Fridays. One of the things I hear a lot is, I don't want my community to become like Marda Loop. Now, if you live in Marda Loop, you might love it and you might not like it at all. And you may be looking for somewhere else. And we've heard from people who they did live there and then they moved out. But it's really important that when we say we don't want something or where that understanding sort of where the fear comes from and the concern comes from, it's really important also to understand the context of how a community evolved the way that it did. And so Marda Loop is a bit of a unique circumstance, and we have to look at the unique circumstance behind how Marda Loop became like how it was. So I lived over that area. So I lived in South Calgary, so south of 50th, so I lived a block away from Central Memorial for my first couple of years of high school. I was previously in Lakeview before that, but then my family moved, and so we were actually in an attached house in South Calgary, which is now North Glenmore Park. And so I had a lot of friends who lived also then in that sort of Marda Loop, South Calgary area. So north of 50th, so between 50th and we'll say 33rd. So I had lots of friends who went over to high school and they lived over there then. At that same time, CFB was still part of Calgary. So there was still the base and there were all of the houses that were part of the base that were part of now what has collectively become Garrison Woods. I'm Garrison Green. And it was very spread out. And so a couple things happened in that transition. At that same time, all of that land use that existed within that area between 50th and 33rd, and even further to the north, so 33rd to like 26th-ish, I think actually all the way to 17th, those lots were already zoned RC2. So they had an RC2 zoning. A lot of them had single detached on them. Some had more, but the base lots in there, and of course there were some multis in there for sure, but the base lot was RC2. And so as Garrison Woods came online, so we have to think now a whole bunch of homes got rearranged, new homes got built. So Garrison Green started building out, in the early 2000s. And then at the same time, all of those homes that were sort of between 50th, and we're just going to call it South Calgary, and that South Calgary community, they were not in great shape, a lot of them. So there were some owners, but there was a lot of rental homes and a lot of rental properties in really, really, really poor condition. Because they were renting to sort of the supplementary, so there wasn't enough housing on the base for everybody, and so they were renting to a lot of the military families, and they weren't in great condition. And so as those homes came to market, because there was RC2 zoning, it made sense from a financial perspective, of course, to rebuild attached housing, so side by sides. And so that started. And so if you can actually drive through South Calgary and you can see the generation of builds that have happened starting, in the late 90s, the very late 90s through to the early 2000s, you can see the house form and shape change, right, through the architecture style. So the evolution of South Calgary has happened over 25 to 30 years. And so it didn't pop up overnight. And remember, it had base zoning to do this already. Meanwhile, all of the other communities, so the exception in Ward 11, and I'm only going to talk sort of just Ward 11, has been Windsor Park. And Windsor Park, again, has sort of seen some of that, where they have some RC2 zoning. There's a couple spots in Kingsland that have it. But for the most part, the rest of the communities that have surrounded in the south have base zoning of RC1. Which means that the evolution of attached housing was singularly happening in one community for the most part in the south because it wasn't permissible anywhere else. It was the only place that it could happen. And so then you build out essentially a new community of Garrison Woods. Changes happen in South Calgary where you start to get more attached housing, and you also have a grid pattern. A grid pattern allows for housing to be built a lot easier than we have in cul-de-sacs and streets with but generally it's a little bit more predictable. So it's in some ways a lot easier to do rezoning or to do row housing or attached housing for the most part on grid streets. And so we start to see the same thing that happen in neighborhoods like Montgomery and Capitol Hill. So a lot of the communities actually north of the river have more grid patterns than south of the river. So we have a context where you had a historic land use, which was RC2, so it made it permissible to do kind of attached housing. It was the only neighborhood essentially in the area that had it. It's happened over a period of 25 years. So what does that bring us to today? So when I hear people say, I don't want my community to become like Marda Loop. Well, let's talk about the conditions that we would enter. So the conditions that we would enter in a base zoning of RCG across the entire city, so all communities, so let's talk about 100 established communities compared to one community. So when you think about the market opportunities on where that could happen, it is now spread out across 100 plus communities versus one community. So the market pressures will be dissipated. And not all lots are going to be great, for an RCG, for a row house type lot. Cul-de-sacs are not great locations. Straight streets are great. However, in order for that even to happen, someone has to move and sell. So if your entire street just never sells and never moves, then nothing changes. So we have to always remember that too. So base zoning may change, but your community may not change because it would require that house to go to market. The condition of that house is going to matter as well. If you have a house in a very, very good condition, it is unlikely an investor is going to purchase it to tear it down to build it into something else. So we have to keep that in mind when we think about how the market drives this kind of housing as well. And so there has a number of factors that will lead to what could become RCG in a neighborhood, or even like an RC2, an attached housing type product in a neighborhood. So there's many conditions for that. There's people who are going to have the capital to do it. The street form is going to have to be permissive of it. And the housing condition that you buy into is going to have to be. RCG is, by land use application, permitted in all neighborhoods right now. So I have a lot of communities saying, I don't want RCGs, in my neighborhood. And I'm saying, well, no one has asked for those yet. In fact, what we've seen in most neighborhoods, and I'll take Lakeview for an example, we see a lot of homes that are in older condition. And they're not sort of like renovatable, right? And what's happening is they're getting built down in large detached housing, so large single form housing is getting put in there. And the height of that single form housing is pretty much bang on identical to the height of attached housing. There is a 1 meter difference. So we're talking 3 feet. That's imperceptible. And when we think even about shadowing, that's imperceptible. That is like 15 minutes of time. So the land use that's already permitted in most neighborhoods, the scale is growing, right? In established neighborhoods, when people are replacing single for single, those singles are growing to be exponentially larger than the existing older bungalows that, you know, many of us grew up in or live in, you know, that were built in the late 50s, early 60s, and even some of the 70s homes. So will your community become like Marda Loop? It's actually highly unlikely. And if it does happen, that is a change that happened over 25 years in a concentrated neighborhood because it wasn't permitted anywhere else. So yes, are we going to see row homes in communities? We are, and I hope that we do, because they're a great living option for a lot of people. Are we going to see more attached housing as well in communities? We're probably going to see more even RC2. I want to dig into affordability a little bit later. I don't have the time today because I need to get back to a group of amazing young women who are about to talk about transit through the She Governs program. If you're catching the end, it's She Governs today. It's a panel of amazing young women who come and talk about the issues, and they get their first entry to politics. They're in grades 9 through 12, and they're having great conversations today. And I really want to get back to them because youth voices are super critical and super important. So the takeaway today is change is incremental, change is slow, but change is also needed. And we're going to dig into this more as the weeks go. Yeah. And again, some people love Marda Loop, some people don't. And you know what? The choice will remain and communities will evolve slowly, and there's still going to be lots of choice across our whole city. We're big, but we need to be bold. Talk to y'all soon.